The Sands Hotel, Las Vegas, December 1961. The spotlight hit Dean Martin like liquid gold, and for a moment, the entire room forgot how to breathe. He stood there in his perfectly imperfect tuxedo, a tumbler of what everyone assumed was whiskey catching the light, that crooked smile playing at the corner of his mouth like he was in on a joke the rest of the world would never understand. The orchestra swelled behind him, brass and rhythm pulsing like a single heartbeat. The crowd leaned forward, drunk on martinis in proximity to magic. This was the King of Cool, at the height of his kingdom, effortless and untouchable, a man who made singing look like breathing and made loneliness look like freedom. But something was different that night. If you knew where to look, if you understood the language of silences that Dean spoke better than English, you could see it in the way his fingers tightened around the microphone stand, in the half-second delay before each smile, in the way his eyes scanned the room not for admiration but for exits, because 3 hours earlier, in a back room that smelled of cigar smoke and expensive cologne, Sam Giancana had made him an offer, not the kind you negotiate, the kind that comes with a smile and a pat on the shoulder, and the unspoken understanding that men who say no to Sam Giancana tend to have very short memories, or very short lives. The band kept playing, the applause swelled, and somewhere between "That's Amore" and a whispered aside to the audience, Dean Martin was making calculations that had nothing to do with music, while Frank Sinatra was busy courting presidents and mob bosses, desperate to be the bridge between the White House and the underworld. Dean had always stood apart. He was the only man in the room who didn't want anything from anybody. But that didn't mean they didn't want something from him. "You're close to Jack," Sam had said earlier, his voice smooth as aged bourbon, sitting in that velvet-lined sanctuary where laughter died and the real business of Las Vegas began. "You talk to him, you listen, you tell me what he's planning." Simple, simple. The word had hung in the air like a noose. This was asking him to choose between two worlds that had both claimed pieces of his soul. This was asking him to betray a friend or betray the only code that mattered to a kid from Ohio who'd learned early that your word was the only thing you owned that couldn't be taken from you. Most men, faced with the Chicago boss, would fold, smile, nod, survive. Because you don't say no to Sam Giancana, not if you like waking up in the morning. But Dean Martin, the man who never looked like anything bothered him, who made everything look like a party, did something that night that could have gotten him killed. Something so quiet, so stubborn, and so dangerously honest that it revealed the true man beneath the effortless cool. In that suffocating room, he looked at the most dangerous man in America and drew a line in the sand that could have become his grave. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to that December night in 1961, when the coolest man in America became the bravest. The funny thing about standing at the summit of the world is how thin the air gets, how every breath feels borrowed. By December 1961, Dean Martin wasn't just performing at the Sands Hotel. He was the gravitational center around which the entire American century seemed to orbit. Every night at 9, the spotlight found him like it was coming home, and for 90 minutes, the world made perfect sense in a way it never did outside those velvet walls. He owned that stage the way other men owned property, with an ease that made ownership look accidental, almost apologetic. But it was all architecture. Beautiful, deliberate architecture. The man who stumbled through his songs like he'd wandered in from the bar was actually a clock, up at dawn while Frank was still sleeping off his hangovers, scripts memorized, arrangements reviewed. The amber liquid that everyone swore was whiskey was usually apple juice, and the charming slur was timed to the millisecond for maximum effect. Dean Martin wasn't a drunk. He was a shark wearing a very convincing costume. The lovable fool act gave him the most valuable currency in show business. He could be in every room while appearing to notice nothing. That invisibility made him magnetic to everyone, including presidents. While Frank burned hot, chasing power and influence with desperate intensity, and Sammy worked like he was racing against extinction, Dean floated. He stood half a step back from everything, even within the Rat Pack itself. When Jack Kennedy needed to slip his tie loose and let the heroic mask of Camelot tilt just a fraction, he turned to Dean. Not because Dean wanted anything from him, but precisely because he didn't. No ambassadorships, no policy influence, no photographs for the mantelpiece. Just an easy friendship between two men who understood that charm was a survival skill. But December 1961 was different, even if the audience couldn't have told you why. The tectonic plates of American power were shifting beneath the desert floor. Bobby Kennedy had declared war on the very men who built the stages Dean sang on, and the Chicago outfit was losing patience. They felt betrayed by the administration they believed they'd helped elect, and they were looking for leverage. They needed eyes and ears inside the Kennedy circle. And who was closer to that circle than the man who made the president laugh? Who was more invisible than the drunk singer nobody took seriously? The tension hummed under the glamour like an electrical current. Subpoenas, wiretaps, televised hearings. Men who used to dine in corner booths were suddenly showing up in mugshots. The entertainers felt it first, that chill that slipped into warm rooms when certain names came up. Wives started asking quiet questions. Lawyers began talking about distance. Dean's longtime valet would say decades later that Mr. Martin only got truly serious twice in all the years he knew him. Once when his son was born, and once after a meeting in Vegas that he never talked about. The call came on an ordinary afternoon, not a request. A summons. The Sands manager appeared in his dressing room, smile stretched too tight. "Dean, there's a friend from Chicago in town. He'd like a word." Dean's hand, toweling his face, paused for just a heartbeat. Just enough. "Chicago, huh?" His voice stayed light, but his eyes went flat and distant. "He says you'll know who he is. Said to tell you it'd be appreciated." There it was, the weight behind innocent words. Later, walking through the casino toward the private rooms, Dean wasn't humming under his breath like usual. For the first time, the man who seemed to fear nothing looked like he was weighing whether tonight was the night his luck finally ran out. Sam Giancana wasn't a man you met. He was a climate you survived. In the subterranean ecosystem of 1960s America, he moved like weather itself, unpredictable, inescapable, capable of turning a perfect day lethal without warning. To tourists sipping martinis in Vegas showrooms, he was invisible. To the FBI, he was public enemy number one. But to the men who built the neon kingdom of Las Vegas, Sam was the landlord who never needed to knock. He didn't look like the devil, which was the problem. Sam looked like somebody's uncle at a wedding, well-dressed, generous with compliments, the kind of man who remembered birthdays and asked about your children. But Chicago's West Side had taught him early that in certain neighborhoods, silence was a language, and violence was punctuation. By 1961, he wasn't just a gangster. He was the quiet architect of American nightlife, the man whose signature appeared on no contracts, but whose approval built every stage where legends were born. The math was brutally simple. Every casino on the Strip had invisible partners. The Sands, the Copa, the Flamingo, all of them floated on rivers of laundered cash that flowed from Chicago, New York, Detroit. The stages where Dean and Frank became gods weren't built on dreams. They were constructed with mob money, protected by mob muscle, promoted through mob connections. To Sam, that meant the performers owed him, not gratitude, obedience. The arrangement had been beautiful for years. Vegas was a machine that transformed illegal money into legitimate profit while giving America the greatest show it had ever seen. The casinos printed cash. The entertainers became immortal. The outfit got richer and cleaner. It was the perfect American hustle. with Sam Giancana sitting at the center like a spider, feeling every vibration in his web. Then, the Kennedys betrayed him. That's how Sam saw it. And in his universe, perception was the only reality that mattered. The Chicago machine had delivered crucial votes in 1960. Old Joe Kennedy had done business with the outfit when it was profitable. Sam had even shared a girlfriend with the president, for Christ's sake. They were connected by mutual benefit and shared secrets. But instead of the promised blind eye, Bobby Kennedy launched a crusade, dragging mobsters in front of television cameras like common criminals instead of the architects of American prosperity. Sam needed leverage. He needed to know what the Attorney General was planning, where the prosecutions were heading, which families were being targeted next. He needed insurance against extinction. Frank Sinatra seemed obvious at first. Frank was desperate to be the bridge between worlds, collecting presidents and mobsters like trophies. But that desperation made him useless. He was a neon sign in a world that required shadows. When Frank walked into a room, the air pressure changed. Everyone looked. And for what Sam needed now, intelligence, leverage, dirt, he didn't need a star. He needed a ghost. FBI surveillance tapes would later capture fragments of the conversation in Chicago. Sam, irritated with Sinatra's volatility, he's always talking. I don't need talking. I need listening. A pause, the murmur of other voices, glasses clinking. Then quieter. What about the other one? The sleepy one. They trust him. The logic was cold and terrifyingly sound. Dean Martin was Italian, which meant something in Sam's world. He had access through Peter Lawford and the Kennedy Circle. He was exactly the kind of man Jack would let his guard down around. And Dean, with that charming fog of indifference, could be a wiretap that breathed, gathering intelligence without anyone suspecting he was even capable of paying attention. In a private office in Chicago, Sam Giancana wrote Dean Martin's name on a piece of paper and underlined it twice. Not a request, an assignment. The man who made everything look easy was about to discover that some things were impossible to make look like anything but what they were. The room smelled like power and felt like a tomb. Not the cologne or cigars, though both hung in the air like expensive ghosts, but something deeper, the scent of air that hadn't circulated freely in years, heavy with secrets that would never see daylight. The Sands casino noise died behind thick doors and thicker carpet until all that remained was the soft hum of distant slot machines and the weight of Dean's own footsteps. He walked slower than usual, hands loose at his sides, but his spine carried a tension that had nothing to do with the performance he'd just finished. Sam Giancana was already seated behind a desk that looked borrowed from a senator's office, flanked by two men who weren't there for conversation. The room was designed to make you feel small, plush surfaces that swallowed sound, lighting just dim enough that you couldn't quite see the corners, air conditioning that hummed like a low, persistent threat. When Dean entered, he didn't swagger or flash the $1,000,000 smile. He walked in like a man entering a cage with an animal he respected, but didn't trust. Sam stood, arms open, the picture of warmth. They embraced like old friends, which in a certain light they were. Sam had been there in the early days, smoothing paths, making introductions, ensuring certain club owners understood that Dean Martin was not to be disrespected. That kind of help created debts that never expired, only accumulated interest. Dino, you look good. Success agrees with you. Sam gestured to a chair, not a request. Dean sat, letting his body language do what it always did, suggest a man too relaxed to be dangerous, too charming to be calculating. He crossed his legs, smiled that crooked smile. The small talk lasted exactly long enough to establish the temperature. Sam asked about the show, about Frank, about Dean's golf game, but his eyes were doing different work, measuring, assessing, looking for seams in Dean's armor. You know, paisan, Sam said finally, the word hanging between them like a hook wrapped in velvet. Guys like you and me, we come from the same kind of streets. We don't forget where we came from. At least, we shouldn't. He leaned forward, elbows on polished wood. You're friendly with the new president. Guy likes you. I hear he laughs around you." Dean shrugged, keeping his voice light. "I try not to bore people. Bad for business." Sam's smile stayed put, but his voice dropped to something more intimate. "Thing is, we helped that kid into the big chair, did him some favors. And now his brother, this Bobby, he's forgetting who his friends are, making life difficult for some very good people." The warmth never left his tone, but his eyes went flat and hard. "I don't like surprises. Right now, that family in Washington is one big surprise. I need someone I can trust to keep an ear open. You're close to Jack. You hear things. You tell me what's important. Simple." There it was. Finally, naked and simple. Dean felt the walls closing in. This wasn't a favor between friends. This was conscription. He bought himself time by looking thoughtful, channeling every ounce of his stage persona to hide the calculation racing through his mind. When he spoke, his voice carried just the right note of apologetic stupidity. "Sam, I'd love to help. I really would. But here's the thing. Bobby already warned Jack about me. Said I'm too close to certain people, that I'm a security risk. They don't talk business around me anymore. Hell, if I start asking questions now, they'll know exactly who sent me." It was brilliant deflection. He was painting himself as useless, not defiant, compromised, not principled. Sam stared at him for a long, agonizing minute, scanning Dean's face for the lie, wondering if the man in front of him was the dumbest guy in Vegas or the smartest operator he'd ever met. In that suspended moment, Dean understood he wasn't being asked a favor. He was being measured for either a uniform or a coffin. The silence that followed Dean's refusal wasn't empty. It was heavy with the kind of calculations that end lives. Sam Giancana didn't blink, didn't move, just sat there, turning Dean's words over in his mind, like a jeweler examining a possibly flawed diamond. Dean had played the most dangerous card in the deck, claiming he was already marked as compromised by the very people Sam wanted him to spy on. It was a defense built on admitted weakness, on the idea that he was too radioactive to be useful. But in Sam's world, useless things were often discarded as carelessly as they were acquired. Dean didn't fidget or reach for a drink or crack a joke to break the tension. He just sat there, projecting a calm he didn't feel, letting the silence stretch until it became a physical weight pressing against his chest. This was the gamble, betting that Sam needed him alive more than he needed him dead, that killing Dean Martin would bring the kind of federal heat even the Chicago outfit couldn't easily manage. When Sam finally waved him away with a dismissive gesture that said, "Get out before I change my mind," Dean walked out with his back prickling, half expecting a sound, a movement, something final. But the real genius of Dean's refusal was that now he had to make it true. If his story to Sam was going to hold, he had to become the security risk he'd claimed to be. So he started building his alibi with wreckage. He showed up late to a recording session for the first time in his career, mumbling apologies about a long night. He missed a golf date with Peter Lawford, claiming he'd overslept. At the next Rat Pack show, he stumbled through songs he could have sung in his sleep, playing up the drunk routine until it stopped being charming and started looking pathetic. The cruelest sacrifice was the friendship that had meant everything to him. Dean began distancing himself from Jack Kennedy, not dramatically, but deliberately. Invitations went unanswered. Phone calls weren't returned. When they did cross paths, Dean was cordial but vague, always heading somewhere else, always just leaving. It killed him because the friendship had been real, one of the few relationships in his life that didn't want something from him. But if he was going to survive Sam's suspicion, he had to destroy his own reputation to protect his integrity. Frank noticed immediately and hated it, interpreting Dean's withdrawal as betrayal, or worse, weakness. The Rat Pack began to fracture under the weight of secrets Dean couldn't share. The chemistry that made their shows electric started to corrode as Dean showed up, hit his marks, collected his check, but remained somewhere else, even when he was standing right there. The pressure came in small doses. Security guards at the Sands, who used to smile, were replaced by strangers with cold eyes. Room service took longer. Messages weren't delivered. small frictions that reminded him every day that he was a guest in a house owned by wolves. But Dean refused to hire bodyguards or change his routine, understanding that visible fear was confirmed guilt. 3 weeks later, the message became explicit. A casino worker suspected of talking to federal agents disappeared, his body found in the desert arranged in a way that suggested the manner of death mattered as much as the death itself. Dean saw the newspaper photos over breakfast, his coffee going cold in his hand. He understood perfectly. This was Sam's postcard, mailed straight to his conscience, reminding him what happened to people who made the wrong choice. That night, Dean walked onto the sand stage, glass in hand, and sang with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The audience roared, thinking it was all part of the act. They didn't know they were watching a man walk a tightrope over an abyss, refusing to look down, carrying the weight of survival with the same grace he carried a tune. The thing about integrity is that it doesn't come with a receipt, and you never really stop paying for it. Every morning after that December night in 1961, Dean Martin woke up, not knowing if this was the day Sam Giancana decided his patience had expired, if the equation had shifted, and Dean's continued existence had become more trouble than his silence was worth. But what haunted him more than the threat of violence was the slow, inexorable erosion of everything he'd built. Relationships, trust, the easy brotherhood that had made the Rat Pack feel like family rather than business. Time has a way of sanding the edges off danger until all that's left is nostalgia. But the consequences of Dean's refusal spread through his life like cracks in foundation. The Rat Pack was the first casualty, though the world never saw it that way. On the surface, they were still a phenomenon, packed showrooms, breathless gossip columns, the myth of brotherhood sold in 8x10 glossies. But something essential had shifted. Frank couldn't understand why Dean had pulled away, why the brother he'd built an empire with suddenly seemed allergic to the spotlight they'd shared. The shows continued through 1962 and beyond, but the magic had leaked out, replaced by something mechanical and heartbreaking. Dean showed up, performed brilliantly, and disappeared, carrying secrets that made intimacy impossible. He began to drift away from everything, one careful no at a time. No to campaign stops, no to White House visits, no to another week in Vegas when he could be home. People called it laziness, arrogance, his famous indifference finally curdling into disrespect. He let them think it. It was easier to be labeled selfish than to explain that every public step closer to the Kennedy orbit put a target back on his chest and turned his survival strategy into a provocation. Then, November 22, 1963, tore through the country like a bullet through bone, and with it came the impossible arithmetic of guilt. When the news broke from Dallas, Dean went pale, excused himself from the movie set where he was working, and didn't return for 2 days. In the brutal privacy of 3 a.m, he turned over the same thought like a stone that could never be worn smooth. If he had done what Sam asked, if he had listened, reported, traded integrity for intelligence, would anything have changed? Could he have tipped someone off, nudged some invisible lever, altered the trajectory of that motorcade? The rational part of him knew it was magical thinking. The forces that killed a president were galaxies beyond one singer's choices. But guilt doesn't care about reason. It only knows how to whisper the same question. You were there. You knew these men. You walked through the smoke between them. Maybe, maybe, maybe. He retreated deeper into the sanctuary of his family, where the stakes were love and homework rather than leverage and loyalty. His daughter Deanna would later recall how her father seemed to carry a sadness he never named, a protective intensity that made him check locks twice and watch cars on the street a little too closely. The King of Cool wasn't just an act anymore. It had become a fortress, and inside that fortress lived a man who had looked into the abyss, made his choice, and decided that the only safe place was behind a mask so perfect nobody would ever think to look underneath. Decades later, when FBI files were declassified and aging mob associates started talking to historians instead of each other, fragments of that Vegas story began to surface. But by then, Dean was gone, having taken his truth to the grave with the same elegant discretion he applied to everything else, leaving behind a legacy that looked like indifference, but was actually the hardest work of all. There's a photograph from 1975 that tells you everything if you know how to read it. Dean Martin on stage at the MGM Grand, tuxedo slightly rumpled, that familiar tumbler catching the spotlight, smile in place like always. The audience sees a legend coasting on charm, and that's exactly what he wanted them to see. Because by then, Dean had learned the most dangerous lesson in show business. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let the world think you're weak while you're actually holding up the sky. We prefer our legends simple, and Dean understood that. We want the Rat Pack to be just booze and broads and ring-a-ding-ding, because acknowledging the darkness underneath makes the party less fun. We want Dean Martin to be the happy drunk who stumbled through life with a martini in one hand and a golf club in the other, because if that was just an act, then we have to confront an uncomfortable truth. He was hiding from a world that demanded pieces of his soul as the price of admission. But the stories that matter most aren't about what a man owned, but what he refused to sell. Dean's legend was built on laughter, on that lazy grin and the sense that nothing in the world could touch him. Underneath the tuxedo and the timing, though, was a private rule book written long before the Rat Pack or the Sands or Sam Giancana. A simple code: you don't betray a friend, and you don't trade your soul for safety, no matter who's asking. The real story lived in the moments nobody saw. The quiet stand that never made headlines. The canceled appearance when a crew member's kid got sick, and Dean made sure there was a check in an envelope. No signatures, no publicity. The time he refused to go on stage until a black musician was allowed to walk through the front door instead of the alley. No press conference, no righteous speech, just a delay, a conversation, and then a policy that quietly changed and never changed back. Decades later, some grandson finding an old union card or a signed photograph and saying, "My granddad always said Dean Martin saved his job." Said he never talked about it, though. That Vegas standoff with Sam Giancana wasn't an exception. It was the purest expression of who Dean had always been. He didn't flip the table or declare himself a hero. He deliberately made himself look smaller, weaker, less useful, all to protect something fragile and invisible, his own sense of right and wrong. He let his reputation take the hit, so his conscience didn't have to. In a town where everyone was selling pieces of themselves, he chose to disappear further into his own myth rather than advertise his courage. Think about the sheer discipline required to maintain that silence for 30 years, to never brag about standing up to the mob, to never seek credit for protecting a friend's presidency, to let people call you lazy, disengaged, or drunk, rather than reveal the dangerous game you were playing to keep your family safe. That isn't indifference. That is a kind of courage so profound it doesn't even need recognition to exist. Character isn't revealed in the spotlight. It's revealed in the dark, in the quiet, in the moments when nobody is watching and there's no applause for doing the right thing. His children eventually pieced it together, the sudden distances, the cryptic warnings, the shadow that sometimes fell across his face when certain names were mentioned. Dean Martin would later write about discovering that her father's silences weren't emptiness, but protection, that his retreat from fame wasn't exhaustion, but strategy, that the man she thought was running away from something was actually standing his ground in the only way that allowed him to survive it. They realized that their father's famous detachment wasn't an absence of feeling, but a fortress built to keep the darkness from getting in. The universal truth buried in Dean's story is that integrity often wears the mask of its opposite. Real courage doesn't always announce itself with speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes it's quieter than that, lonelier, performed in rooms where there are no witnesses and no applause. It's the ability to choose the harder path and then never mention that there was a choice at all. Dean understood something most people spend their whole lives learning, that the truest version of yourself is often the one nobody sees. The decisions made in darkness that shape everything the light touches. So when you look at that photograph from 1975, or any of the thousands of images of Dean Martin looking like he's barely paying attention, remember what you're actually witnessing. Not a drunk playboy or a fading star, but a man who figured out how to be brave without looking brave, how to stand for something without standing on a soapbox, how to carry impossible secrets with such grace that the weight became invisible. He walked through fire without letting anyone smell the smoke on his tuxedo, and he did it for 30 years, until the very end. The spotlight fades, the lights go down, and the applause eventually stops. But character remains. It stands there in the dark, unbending and unbroken, long after the last drink has been poured and the last note has drifted away. Dean Martin left the building a long time ago, but the echo of his integrity is still ringing in the room, if you know how to listen for it. Everybody loves somebody sometime, but Dean loved his own code more than he loved fame, and he proved it in the only way that counted, when nobody was watching, when saying yes would have made his life easier and his conscience unlivable. That's the kind of legend worth keeping alive.